Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for doctors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. This current series focuses on demystifying the Medical Council statements. Today's podcast is all about good prescribing, and I've titled it, "The Prescriber's Pen is Mightier Than the Sword." Today I'm joined by two people. I've got Mr. Adam Holloway, who's one of the lawyers at Watt & Carney, our panel law firm. We really want to welcome you, Adam. So glad you can join us today.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me.
And I'm also joined by Dr. Lucy Gibbard, who's one of my colleagues at Medical Protection.
Thanks, Sam.
Let's start with a case, shall we? This case is based on a number of cases I've managed over the years. Dr. Jones is a general medical consultant who has a reputation for being thorough, knowledgeable, and very good with building rapport with her patients. Dr. Jones is on a busy post-acute ward round with the house officer. The registrar happens to be on leave. Mrs. Jansen, a 65-year-old woman, has been admitted for optimisation of her diabetes. She's developed pyelonephritis, and Dr. Jones decides to treat her with IV Augmentin. Dr. Jones is aware that the patient has been prescribed cephalosporin previously without any problems. The house officer had noted on the inside of the drug chart that Mrs. Jansen had anaphylaxis to penicillin. There was a secondary box in the clinical notes that should have noted the allergy, but had not been filled in. Neither the consultant nor the house officer noted the drug allergy. The nurse who drew up the antibiotics did not check the drug chart for allergies, and whilst administering the antibiotics noted that the patient was developing an anaphylactic reaction. Sadly, Mrs. Jansen died. And whilst most medication errors don't lead to such life-altering outcomes, sadly it does happen. A New Zealand study published in 2017 looking at medication-related patient harm in New Zealand hospitals found that 28% of the 2,659 patients reviewed experienced medication-related harm, that harm ranging from mild to death. And that doesn't imply error. So even though there might have been harm, it doesn't mean that an error was made in terms of the medication. The rate per 100 admissions was 34.7, so nearly 30% of the identified harm originated in the community and led to the hospital admission. So that's quite a startling statistic, isn't it, Lucy, that 30% of identified harm from medication actually originates in primary care.
Yeah, it is a bit horrifying, yeah. And as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean there's been an error. It's just that drugs can be powerful and cause harm, can't they?
That's right. So medication errors are very common. The Medical Council statement, Good Prescribing Practice, states that we should be familiar with the indications, adverse effects, contraindications, and major drug interactions and appropriate dosages, monitoring requirements, effectiveness, and cost-effectiveness of the medications that you prescribe. And of course, it's not news to any of us that we need to check drug allergies prior to prescribing and carefully document this in an appropriate way. So, Dr. Jones, the consultant, is thorough, knowledgeable, and communicates well with her patients. But how do you think this went wrong?
Yeah, well, I think there were a number of aspects to what happened here that are probably quite common. For a start, it was a busy, time-pressured ward round, and often, actually, it's not a time when you're sitting down with notes and looking through them carefully. The doctor was probably distracted. There wasn't a registrar there that day, so probably the house surgeon was trying to do two jobs at the same time. The alerts hadn't been annotated properly by the house officer, who was obviously too busy. The fact that the patient had had a cephalosporin before without concern probably gave a level of reassurance that was, unfortunately inappropriate. And I think the other thing, I'm just thinking of a case that I had, is that the hospital IT systems aren't always very good at flagging allergies. And I had one particular case where an allergy had been recorded in the notes, but that hadn't then gone into the medication part of the IT system. So, I think often there are systems problems here as well. And that actually if the prescribing IT was maybe better integrated, it would be harder to do this without a big alert coming up.
I would agree with that. And I think depending on which hospital you work in, they all have different IT systems. But often you have to annotate the allergy in multiple places.
Yeah.
So if you just miss one of them, I think that's enough often for it to be missed.
And the case I had, there were 3 different systems that the allergies had to be in one hospital admission, and also that it didn't then, the allergy didn't automatically go to the next admission. That actually it was, so IT is an issue here.
I think it's less likely to happen in primary care due to everyone's on the one system. And so it's easier to find it. And I think the biggest issue for primary care is probably more alert fatigue. What is it called? Alert fatigue.
Yeah.
Where you see so many alerts come up that you fail then to read them. Adam, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just on that last point, I've certainly had cases where alerts in primary care have been missed. Examples happened particularly over the pandemic where the model of care changed, and so you had practitioners often doing things over the telephone or going and seeing people in a car park and not having their system immediately in front of them. So it's worth being aware that if you're doing something differently for the first time, you can take for granted that an alert will pop up or come to your attention, where if the model of care has changed, you might miss that. But I think also in primary care, and as GPs, you guys are the experts, but there are still different ways in which alerts can be put into the notes. And if you're really expecting it to be in one field, but someone's put it somewhere else, then it is an opportunity to miss. And one of the very fundamental things, which of course you can do, is talk to the patient. And many people, not all of course, but many people will be aware if they have allergies, and it's an easy thing to do to have that conversation.
And I think in this case it would have been helpful if the consultant had just asked the patient, who was right there with her. But hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Interestingly, the HDC produced a report on medication errors, which they published in 2018. And that notes that many medication errors were slips or lapses where clinicians made inadvertent errors, often due to the conditions they were working under. And, obviously the conditions that doctors are working under now are even more difficult than they were a few years ago. So how can clinicians protect themselves?
Yeah, look, it's hard because often it's a human error at a time when you are under pressure. But look, we all have routines and processes in the way we do things. And like Adam says, you've got to kind of think about when you're not in that routine, but also you want to make sure that your routine is very set and that actually you follow it regularly, and then hopefully that routine will include a check of allergies or something along those lines. And also we have to think about those times when we are under pressure and cutting corners, that actually we can't do that. When patient safety is at the heart of this, there isn't that ability to cut corners. You have to check every time. In this particular thing, as we've said, Dr. Jones could have talked to the patient, that would have been useful. Equally, the house surgeon could have looked at it, the nurse could have looked at it. It's always that Swiss cheese kind of issue, isn't it? But I think the more we can follow our processes and stick to them, the safer patients are.
And I think the HDC report found that the majority of medication errors in their complaints that they'd received and the data that they had were due to a complex interplay of human and organisational factors. And as you said, the Swiss cheese, it's very rarely just one person's error. It is always a combination of things. So let's think about organisational factors. I know that there is often little that can be done about the health sector overall at this point. So, Adam, for clinicians working within a hospital system, what can they actually do?
Well, there's a question over timing. So thinking first about when an error has occurred and we're dealing with the consequences of that. So, for example, a complaint to the HDC. Organisational factors will be relevant, and we will always discuss those where they are relevant, but they're unlikely to be a complete answer to an error that has occurred. Really, the critical time, of course, is to try and stop these things from happening. And if you are in an environment where you do perceive there to be these risks, then ideally clinicians will proactively raise the issues. So talk about resourcing issues with management if you think that there's a matter of patient safety that's arisen. Turn your mind to the processes and policies in place. Have a hand in revising them. That might not be your role, but you can, of course, try and find out who's the clinical lead, who's the manager of the service, who needs to be told if you can see something's not working well. Try and build in those layers of safety, because you can never completely guard against or stop someone having a bad day. But if you've got the systems in there, like, for example, having the right field filled in, then you can prevent that bad day then leading on to the consequence. And part of that, as a system's, of course, made up of both the technology and the people, is trying to make sure that everyone in the team, medical, nursing and pharmacy, etc., know their role in the process and which part of the puzzle is theirs to complete.
That's great, thank you. Let's now think about a primary care case, and this case was This case was based on an actual case with significant details altered to ensure anonymity. Dr. Green is a conscientious GP who has a 70-year-old frail female patient, Mrs. Johnson, who was on multiple pain medications, including opioids, and Mrs. Johnson lives on her own. The GP wanted to avoid any medication mix-up and so asked Mrs. Johnson to make an appointment. Dr. Green simplified the medication list by prescribing a 12.5 microgram fentanyl patch after carefully calculating the conversion rates. Whilst prescribing, Dr. Green accidentally clicked the 100 microgram dose on the drop-down box and sent the prescription off. The pharmacist, who knew Mrs. Johnson well, dispensed the medication. The following morning, the patient's daughter called on her mother and found Mrs. Johnson unconscious but alive and called an ambulance. And following this, an HDC complaint was made. The commonest prescribing errors reported by the HDC is prescribing an inappropriate medication followed by the wrong dose, and in this case it was just a click of the mouse. So Lucy, how can doctors avoid this type of human error? Do you think they can?
Gosh, well, I think the more careful we are, the less likely it is to happen. But I don't think it's very hard to say that it's never going to happen. I mean, I think we've all assisted in cases where it's been clicking the wrong thing. I mean, as you say, it's commonly the inappropriate medication, lorazepam instead of loratadine or amiodarone instead of amitriptyline. You put in the first three letters and click on it, and it's just too easy to do, really. So I think if we're thinking about how do we avoid that, I think when we have to kind of have an alert when there's high-risk medications, and opiates are high-risk medications. So I think if you're prescribing a high-risk medication, you should double-check everything you do. So in this particular situation where you're prescribing opiates to a frail elderly person, that's a situation where you have to be completely sure and you should be double-checking. It used to be easy when we printed out scripts, and you used to often go through the script with the patient saying, here's the script, this one you're going to take 3 times a day, this one you're going to take twice a day, and we'd go through the script with the patient. Whereas now you make an electronic script and most of us are just sending that off into the ether. And so you don't have that opportunity as easily to check the script with the patient. But it maybe is something that we should be doing. And actually, before we hit send, you're actually going through with the patient and saying, this is what's on your script today. The problem is if you just have that one line, sometimes you can't see the dose or the instructions, and actually going into each one, it's very time consuming. So I think, being careful and checking the prescription is useful. Often before you hit send, you do have the opportunity of seeing a PDF version of it. And again, that's a way of a time when you could go through with the patient and check it. The other thing, and we say this all the time, is making sure you have a good relationship with your local pharmacists. You know, the pharmacists often really are a great safety net for us. And I know I've had this before where a pharmacist has rung me up and said, did you really mean to do that? And I hadn't really meant to do it. And so they have saved my bacon. So look, having a good rapport with your pharmacist, making sure they've got your cell phone number, or making sure that your receptionist knows that if the pharmacist calls, that you'll take that call, because it's a call that might actually be really important for patient safety. So, good rapport with your pharmacist, making sure they have a way of contacting you if they have a concern.
I would agree. For me, it was more like a daily call from the pharmacy. Confessions there. And in this case, unfortunately, the pharmacist who knew the patient well didn't flag that it was a big dose of fentanyl that was prescribed, and so unfortunately had dispensed it. Now, Adam, I know this is very limited information that I've explained here, but what do you think would be the outcome if the HDC?
Look, despite just being, as you've said, a click of the mouse, so just a very brief moment in time and an error that confined, if I were confronted with these facts, I'd say my advice would be it's more likely than not that the HDC would choose to formally investigate this complaint rather than deal with it at its lower triage level. And again, once an investigation had been started, probably inevitable that the HDC's opinion would be that there has been a breach of the code and a failure to provide care to the expected standard. Of course, once the HDC does decide to investigate a complaint, it doesn't investigate all complaints, but once you've reached that stage, then the HDC will advise the medical council that it's done so, and the medical council will also then turn its mind to whether the facts are indicative of some wider cause for concern about that practitioner's competence or the way they're practicing. I would say on these facts, probably unlikely that the medical council would take an interest beyond letting the HDC go and do its work, unless there was collateral information from a colleague or a pattern of complaints which suggested this wasn't isolated. But I'd be hopeful that with advice from MPS, the case could be presented to the medical council in a way that let them know, look, it's a one-off, the HDC needs to do its job, and it probably will be a breach, but wouldn't necessarily then trigger a need for some broader assessment of competence by the medical council.
Thanks for that, Adam. What about the pharmacist here?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's been a long time since I've gone and looked at pharmacist statements, so I'm far less confident about predicting the outcome. But I would have thought it likely that the HDC would at least contemplate what they call an adverse comment, where as part of an opinion, as part of their investigation, they will have a practice of making a formal adverse comment in respect of a practitioner, even if their conduct they don't assess to be a breach. They want to really draw attention to it and say, look, there was an opportunity here to do better. And I think if the amount of fentanyl was so obviously large for an elderly and frail patient, then it absolutely was a missed opportunity for making that phone call back to the GP.
Mm. Thank you for that. Let's move on to a really common issue for primary care anyway, prescribing for patients who refuse to come in for review. So the Medical Council statement states it is important that any system for issuing a repeat of an earlier prescription issued to a patient takes full account of the obligations to prescribe responsibly and safely, and that the doctor who signs the prescription takes responsibility for it. Before signing a repeat prescription, you must be satisfied that secure procedures are in place to ensure that each prescription is regularly reviewed so that it is not issued for a medicine that is no longer required, and the correct dose is prescribed for medications where the dose varies during the course of the treatment. You have appropriate information available, which may include access to the patient's clinical records, so that you can review the appropriateness of the repeat prescriptions. And at 35, or the next point, the statement says, patients receiving repeat prescriptions should be assessed in person on a regular basis to ensure that the prescription remains appropriate, adverse effects are monitored, and the patient is taking or using their medicines as intended. Patients who receive a further examination or assessment should not receive repeat prescriptions without being seen by a doctor. This is particularly important in the case of medicines with potentially serious adverse effects. It is at the doctor's discretion whether a patient is given a repeat prescription. Decisions not to issue a repeat prescription should be explained to the patient and documented accordingly. So Lucy, let's just say you have a comorbid patient with type 2 diabetes on insulin. They're on an ACE inhibitor for renal protection and high blood pressure, a lipid-lowering agent, a diuretic for mild heart failure following a mild STEMI 3 years ago. Her last HbA1c was 112, her EGFR was 32 2 years ago. She refuses blood tests or to come into the practice for review. She keeps ringing for repeat phone prescriptions. You're struggling with safe prescribing and you've just read the medical council statement. What do you do?
Oh, as you say, Sam, it's a reasonably common call to MPS with what do I do now? So look, it's obviously a complex patient. You know, she has got poorly controlled diabetes. She has got a number of other medications that could have serious adverse effects. The medical council statement says I shouldn't do a repeat prescription unless I can actually be assured that it's appropriate. And how can I be assured it's appropriate if I can't do a blood test or see her? But then you get left with what is the alternative? Because actually, if you say, I'm not going to give you a script, and then she has no insulin and none of her other medications, surely she's going to be worse off. So you get left with this balance of harms decision. And the problem, because we don't have a crystal ball, it's actually a very hard decision to make. It would be useful if you had other information. You know, is she having hypos? Now we're thinking that her HbA1c is 112, so she's probably not having hypos. But look, is she having any shortness of breath? Is she getting chest pain? You know, what else do I need to know that I don't know? Is there any other way that I could assess her? You know, would she allow a home visit? Can I go and visit her? Could I get a district nurse to go and visit her? Someone to check her blood pressure? Do we know why she won't come in? Is there a mental health disorder or, you know, is there something else? So you do need to do a little bit of investigation, and often getting the rest of your team involved can be very helpful. Sometimes, if it's possible and you've got a consent from her, talking to other family members could be a way of trying to address that as well. But if you're left with the situation of she needs this medication, but she will not have a blood test and she will not come in, you have to then weigh up the risk of prescribing versus the risk of not prescribing, and you need to document that you've thought about it. You've got to think about, you know, if I don't give her these prescriptions, what's the risk of serious harm? If I do give her the prescriptions, what's the risk of serious harm? Write all down the pros and cons, discuss it with your colleagues. In these situations, we often suggest that our members ring the relevant specialist at the hospital or write a letter, even better, and actually say, I'm unable to assess this patient. I am unable to do any blood tests on this patient. These are the medications that she's currently on. Which of these would you suggest I can safely prescribe without seeing her? And actually get a specialist to also give you an opinion. Now, the specialist may be in the same position as you, that it's impossible, but actually the more opinions you can get as to what is the safest way to prescribe. And then I think you also have to carry on trying. You have to carry on ringing and carry on trying to engage. And you have to do your best. That's all you can do. I've had a case where it was a patient on warfarin who didn't want to have their INRs done. And we actually wrote to a specialist about the risk of having a patient on warfarin without checking versus the risk of the patient not being on warfarin with his heart valve. And in the end, the doctor decided to carry on prescribing. But look, there may be other situations with a more elderly patient where it actually would be safer not to prescribe. So it's not going to be the same in every case. It's going to be different. But you have to weigh up those pros and cons, and you have to document all that advice and the decision that you've come to.
It's a very difficult decision, and it's amazing how regularly we get called about patients who are exactly like this. Adam, would you have any advice or views on this? And what would the medical counselor's view be?
Well, I absolutely agree with what Lucy has just run through. And in a way, a scenario like that where you've got a medicine that on the face of it a patient absolutely needs will drive you towards confronting the problem. But I've certainly seen cases where the facts are slightly different. It might be something where you're wanting to help the patient. The patient appreciates having a particular medicine and will deliberately conduct themselves in a way to continue to get repeats because that's what they want. And it is, I've seen doctors get themselves into trouble in hindsight when it's found its way before the relevant authorities, because they can look back over a long period of time and see that they've been trying to do the right thing, but by not bringing a patient in and having those reviews and really confronting whether a medicine continues to be the right choice can result in harm. And so you ask Sam what the medical council think. I've seen and been involved in cases where harm has been suffered from something like, for example, a long-term prescribing of a topical corticosteroid. It's resulted in a complaint and, in fact, a case before the tribunal and a disciplinary finding. So the consequences aren't necessarily trivial for doctors, and it is hard, not only when you have patients like the scenario you've painted who won't come in, but also scenarios of patients who might be seeking a particular sort of medicine, and you can fall into a dynamic of trying to be helpful where ultimately you're, in hindsight, not making a safe decision in respect of that patient.
No, I would agree with that. I think we've all had cases where doctors continue to prescribe without bringing the patient in. And I think, it's a good reminder for all of us that every prescription we sign, we take responsibility for. And I've certainly had members saying to me, oh, but I only re-prescribed what another doctor had already prescribed. And feeling as though in some way that absolves them of responsibility, but ultimately we carry it. And I think it's worth bearing in mind, isn't it?
And I think it is worth having systems whereby you notice when the patient was last seen when you're doing your repeat prescribing, and that you have a really clear protocol in your practice of how often you expect patients to be seen. And that might be different for different medications, and so it may be that if a patient's stable on thyroxine and their TSH is absolutely fine, you may be saying, look, I'm happy to see that person once a year. But there may be somebody else that you're saying, actually, no, I need to see this person every 3 months. And so being really clear about having made that decision about how often people should be reviewed is really useful, and having good protocols is useful too.
I'm always interested in that some doctors just have a greater degree of comfort with not seeing a patient very often. I know certainly in the practice that I work in that some of the doctors are happy to see the patient once a year. Whereas for me, I'm like, seems a bit long. For me, it might be 6 months, but it is about clinical judgment, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there are definitely some patients. I had a patient recently who was saying that she thought for coming in for her thyroxine review was unreasonable because, and you could see a point, but I still said, no, I'm sorry, we do need to see you if we're prescribing for you, we have to set eyes on you and actually check you over. But yeah, you can see why patients feel I'm stable on this medication.
For them, they see it as money, and it's all I need is your signature. It's only a piece of paper that I need from you. So why do I need to pay a full fee for that? But it's the responsibility that we carry. That's why we charge for what we do. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you to Adam and Lucy for sharing your thoughts with us today. There are some really good learning points, I think. And Lucy, would you mind maybe summing up the good learning points we've had today?
Okay, well, look, I think the first one was straight back to what we just talked about, which is having a system, having protocols and things in writing. And, at the end of the day, the chances are at some point in our career we're going to make an error. We are human and errors do happen. So actually having safety nets in the way you prescribe is really helpful. And that means having pharmacists who are happy to ring you if they're concerned about the script, or actually having other doctors on the team or other people looking at the scripts and who might also pick up an error. Being aware of when you're busy or distracted, that actually that's a high risk time, and that actually those are the times when you need to be particularly careful. If you have any doubts, actually talking to the patient is always a good safety net as well. And that situations where we've got a patient who is not wanting to go along with our advice to be assessed or examined, you've really got to weigh up the pros and cons of that and whether or not it's appropriate to continue prescribing. And in those situations, really talking to colleagues and having very good documentation is really helpful, because there is a risk. Either way, risk of refusing to prescribe and a risk of prescribing, and so you've just got to show that you've taken advice and thought hard about it and done your best, basically.
Thank you for that, Lucy. That was really helpful. So thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful for you. We look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection Podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org, and hopefully we'll catch you on the next one.